Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm here from the west coast of Canada. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm the director of the Center for Global Studies here at the University of Victoria, and I would like to warmly welcome you, at least virtually, to the west coast of Canada. And this is, as is tradition here at the University of Victoria, I would like to underline that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. And although we're virtual and you're joining us on your computer screens, it's important to acknowledge where we're based physically and the legacy that comes with the place, and that takes us already into the subject of today's webinar, which is to think about how we deal with past injustices, with the past and how it's being used in contemporary politics and society. So let me again welcome you to this focus on and webinar on Italy, the rise of Giorgia Meloni and the transformation of national memory in this country. And let me give you a little bit of context that this event is part of a webinar series on European and North American perspectives on commemorating the past. And we try to bring together audiences in Europe and here in Canada. And we are very grateful for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for its sponsorship, and also the European Union for allowing us to bring together this network of scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. So in a way, this event is also part of a broader initiative, a multi-year initiative, the so-called Jean Monnet Network on European Memory Politics, which brings together scholars from Canada and Europe on issues related to how the past, in particular the 20th century past, is being interpreted, commemorated, and used in political narratives in contemporary society. So we are very grateful for our funders and the network that we've been able to build, in particular with our partners in Hungary, Poland, France, and Germany. But today we draw our attention to Italy and the legacy of fascism and anti-fascism in this country. And I think it is not surprising to see that there is quite a bit of interest in understanding the political use of memory in Italy, given two current events in Italian politics and society. And you're probably not surprised to hear that the first reference point in this respect are the last general elections in September 22, when we witnessed the rise of a party, the Fratelli d'Italia, the Brothers of Italy, that subsequently formed also government under the leadership and now the country's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. And her rise to power has raised urgent questions about the memory of fascism and anti-fascism and its formative role for Italian national identity and politics. And the reason for this is that the Brothers of Italy have their organizational roots in Italy's neo-fascist movements. Organizationally, they basically built on the legacy of the MSI, the Social Movement of Italy, the neo-fascist organization in post-war Italy, then the Alleanza Nazionale, and they've also kept some of the symbolism that comes with this legacy of neo-fascist parties in Italy. They kept, for example, in terms of the symbolic reference to the neo-fascist movement, the tricolor flame, the so-called fiamma tricolore, with the three colors. And also there's lots of reference to the fascist past by some of its members. For example, the co-leader of the party, La Russo, has lots of fascist memorabilia in his office, and there's this kind of overt reference to the legacy of fascism and neo-fascism in post-war Italy that this party has built on. And also we've seen how the rise of the Fratelli d'Italia has empowered right-wing actors in Italian politics. Here you might recall that in March there was a manifestation of so-called black shirts of supporters of the fascist movement in Mussolini's birth town of Predappio in late 22. This was lot of Roman salutes on display, black shirts, these references. This legacy and, the heroes of the neo-fascist movement, they have come out more into the open. And that's understandably also raised some concerns in the domestic and international media, whether we would witness the revival of fascist elements in the Meloni government taking power. And what, in a way, what we definitely see is an empowerment of the far right. But I think there are reasonable doubts whether we see actually a rebirth of fascism in Italy, because Giorgia Meloni has worked hard to remold her party, pitching it more as a conservative champion of patriotism. For instance, in her book, I Am Giorgia, she insisted she doesn't belong to the cult of fascism, as she put it. I've never felt any sympathy or closeness to anti-democratic regimes, aside fascism included. So, as many other right-wing populist parties across Europe, Meloni has been quite determined to, in a way, undermine the image of a neo-fascist party and pitch the Fratelli d'Italia as a staunchly conservative party. With her motto, God, family, and country, she in a way mimics some other more strongly conservative parties across Europe in this respect. So the rise of Meloni and the Fratelli d'Italia is one of those contexts which gives us pause to think about how does the memory of fascism still shapes contemporary realities, and what does it mean in contemporary Italy. The other historical marker that I briefly would like to mention is the March on Rome. And given its 100th anniversary, it also triggered a debate on the memory of fascism in this country. And the March of Rome, I think it's important to keep in mind, is both about founding myth for the fascist right-wing movement in modern Italian politics. That was the initial and the first fascist power grab in the early 20th century, and it created this myth of power, of empowerment of the far right. But it's also at the same time the negative myth for the left. The March of Rome for the left is, in a way, the origin of the disaster that led Italy into the war, the catastrophic Second World War, German occupation. So the March of Rome is associated with the darkest period in modern Italian history. So we have two founding myths attached to the March on Rome. And in this respect, we thought this is a good time to think about the legacy of fascism and anti-fascism in Italy that, in a way, you could argue has been the foundation of the post-war Italian Republic. That was the reference point of defining a new political identity after the war. But this commitment to the principle and foundation of the anti-fascist foundation of modern Italy has been eroded over the past decades already. I think it started with Silvio Berlusconi's first government, when he brought in the post-fascists from the Alleanza Nazionale, and claiming, I still remember vaguely, that Mussolini never killed anyone in '94, opening the door to a right-wing fragment of the political scene in Italy. And what is interesting to remember is when Silvio Berlusconi did this in '94, there was an outburst of protest against allowing fascist symbols and actors, as it was framed, to take hold again in contemporary the political scene. That didn't happen more recently with the rise of the Fratelli d'Italia. So in a way, what we see, and what could be maybe posed as a question and maybe a provocation, is that the fundamental role that anti-fascism played in post-war Italy no longer has the determining role in shaping responses and political identities as it has. There has been a lesser focus on this. And so that is the background against which we organized this session, and trying to think about what the current development in Italian politics means for the memory of fascism, and what role it still plays for the 21st century. And I'm very pleased to have two distinguished scholars to help me address these questions about, the legacy of the memory of fascism and what it means for today's Italian society. And let me introduce both of them in the order in which they will appear here in this webinar. First, we have Professor Giulia Albanese. Dr. Albanese is an associate professor of modern history at the University of Padua. She pursued her PhD at the EUI, at the European University Institute in Florence, and her research focused on fascism, political violence, and authoritarian culture in the interwar years, and more recently, the memory of fascism more broadly. She is the author of Dittature Mediterranee, Supervisione Fascista e Colpi di Stato in Italia, Spagna e Portogallo, published with La Terza in 2016, and La Marcia su Roma, so the March on Rome, also published with La Terza. And she recently edited Rethinking the History of Italian Fascism that appears with Routledge in 22. Also under work is actually at the moment Places of Fascism, Memory, Politics, and Removal. So Giulia, thank you very much for joining us. And our second panelist today is Professor Amy King from the University of Bristol in the Department of History. Dr. King is a lecturer in modern European history at this university, and her work focuses primarily on the far-right matters from fascism to the present day, how they are looked at in contemporary Italian society. And Amy is currently finishing a book on the memory of an attack on a far-right family in Rome in 1973, known as Rogo di Primavalle, and its role in building far-right communities today. So for this webinar, we decided to have both panelists speak for 10-15 minutes maximum, and then we hopefully keep this relatively conversational. And with this, I would like to invite Giulia to start us off and unmute. And for the audience, please keep your screens, your cameras off, and mute your mics. And then as we go into the discussion, you can raise your hands and I will call upon you to join us with your camera if you like to do so. So with this, over to you, Giulia, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much to you, Oliver, and thanks to the Center for Global Studies of the University of Victoria for inviting me to such a stimulating discussion and topic of discussion. And I would like to try to assess some general contextual elements and then try to propose some idea derived from a recent collective research on the places of memory of fascism that I developed together with other scholars at the Istituto Nazionale Ferruccio Parri, which is a research and public history institute devoted to the memory and history of the resistance. This project developed into a website and a map of the commemorative places of the memory of historical fascism existing in Italy, and in a MOOC which I co-edited with Lucia Cecci, of which you kindly presented. And in this general assessment, I would like to underline, although it's not really, I think you all discussed already this issue, that this ascent to government of Giorgia Meloni is happening in a moment of general crisis of democracy and of its institution, which is far from being exclusively Italian. And I think it's important to reflect on this, because this issue of the memory of historical fascism brought the discussion back to, an exclusively and very national history of relationship with fascism. And although in this moment, I think that international and transnational strands and networks and political ideas and development of far-right, of the international far-right are as important, if not more important, that Italian own history in developing this, in determining this political situation. and with this regard, there has been a great discussion in Italy if the word fascism is the right way to consider the recent political development also outside Europe. And the discussion in Italy developed in a very different way from the international discussion on this topic. I was thinking, for example, to the fact that in April 2018, the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, published a volume titled Fascism, a Warning. And in this book, Albright reflected on the evolution of American politics, as you all know, and it was a reflection which combined her view of the present and the memory of her hard past with the ascent to power of the Third Reich, her exile, and then the return of Czechoslovakia, etc. And in this book, although she was aware of the fact that the history do not repeat, she underlined the comfort of far-right movements nowadays with the ideas developed at the beginning of the 20th century, and denouncing the possibility of a poisoned public life, of a democracy reduced to small majority, using violent rhetoric full of resentment, able to cancel rights and persecuting its own neighborhood. The book brings into question the relationship with the actual far right and historical fascism. Historical fascism, which is generalized, it's not looking at specific experiences of fascism, but which obviously interrogates, in particular, a country like Italy on its own past and oblige in a way to reflect to this past. And it demonstrates nonetheless that the use of the category of fascism as a political category continues to have, or started again to have, and this is also a question to discuss, an evocative power also for different political and cultural tradition, and in national contexts which had very different paths and histories in their relations with fascism. I think that it would be interesting to discuss this aspect. On the other hand, it is important to say that although in different ways, depending on these national histories, these far-right movements and parties, of which the Brothers of History is fully part, cultivates not only racist and hyper-nationalist ideas, authoritarian perspective and models, and a complex dialectic with democratic institutions, but also some form of nostalgia and a feeling of continuity with the past, which is the past of neo-fascist movement after 1945, but also of the nostalgia with the past, with the fascist past. Although the world and politics has widely changed since then. In this context, I think the Italian case is really meaningful since the emptying of democratic institutions started in these countries already in the 90s with the development of Forza Italia and the Berlusconi government, which also were the moment in which, as Oliver reminded us, post-fascist political movements entered for the first time into a government and changing the agenda, the political agenda, and also the way in which the memory of the fascist past became part of an institutional legacy in a way. Although being the object of criticism and irony from democratic leaders of all over the world, there is no doubt that these Berlusconi governments paved the way not only to the rising of Giorgia Meloni and of the Brothers of Italy in Italy, but also to other populist movements and leaders outside the country. And it is clear that the fact that fascism was invented in Italy and that Mussolini led the first fascist regime is part of the historical complexity of the relationship with of Italy with the memory of fascism and with the ways in which these memories of fascism are reenacted, discussed, or reflected upon also elsewhere, and not just in Italy. Starting from that, I would nonetheless stress that I don't believe that Meloni was voted by most of her voters because of fascist nostalgia, and that there are clear political dynamics such as the economic crisis, the failure of the Movimento 5 Stelle in providing an alternative to previous economic policy, but also the fact that Giorgia Meloni and their parties were the only opposition party to the last Draghi government that led Meloni to the government. At the same time, these electoral results demonstrate the indifference and sometimes also the more or less distant benevolence with which the Italian fascist past is regarded, even if in an institutional system which is still strongly, at least for the moment, and formally connected to its anti-fascist past. And that's the reason for I don't think that in this moment it's really useful to discuss in depth the relationship of Fratelli d'Italia with Italian historical fascism and of Meloni herself with this past, although we could comment her initial and declaration on the fascist past, as well as some of the declaration of some of the leaders of the Brothers of Italy, and above all those of the president of the Senate, Ignazio La Russa. But at least for the moment, there's no explicit rehabilitation of fascist regime at stake. And I think that with Amy discussing afterwards, it will become clear that the real issue and engagement of the government, of the Meloni government, is not specifically on the fascist past, but on the neo-fascist past, and on in particular on the role played by the far right in the 70s in Italy. And this is interesting nonetheless because in a way the discussion also in historiographical terms, but certainly in terms of the public discussion of the relationship between the fascist past and the neo-fascist movements in the after-war period, it has not developed as it should have. In a way, it has not been cultivated and reflected upon as it would be needed. And what I would like to stress here is the need and the importance to reflect on the indifference and the distant benevolence which is present in the countries toward the fascist regime and its history, that goes in a way with the normalization of this regime as a mild authoritarian one until the Russian law, which are more or less, and certainly certainly by the leaders of the Brothers of Italy, considered as a turning point and something that stands as a pillar of their affirmation that they are distant from the fascist past. And I think that this idea of the Italian fascist regime during the 20s and the 30s as in a way mild authoritarian regime is part of the blurring of the borders between democracy and authoritarian systems, which in different scales and ways is cultivated by far right and conservative leaders in the country, and not only. It is an attitude, nonetheless, that has a long history that, to summarize in a few words, goes back to the immediate post-war Italian history, when, while anti-fascist institutions were built in widely read magazines, an image of the leaders of historical fascism as benevolent and beloved fathers and husbands was cultivated, and the specific responsibility of the regime and of its leader vis-à-vis anti-fascist exile, people living in occupied Libya, Eritrea, Ethiopia, or in occupied countries, were only rarely the object of trials and of public recognition by the Italian institution for many decades. This attitude towards the fascist regime and the difficulty to coming to terms with this criminal past was not only Italian, it must be said, and has often led to the normalization of the fascist regime as different and without meaningful relationship beside the war alliance with the Nazi regime. And which is part also of the way in which the Allies in a way put or pushed trials against Nazis that were very different from those against fascists. The recent research which I conducted with the Istituto Nazionale Ferruccio Parri shows the extension of a public and commemorative memory of places, people, and events of fascist history still present in Italy, and signs that in many cases were built and entitled by the regime and inherited without any discussion or awareness, and still standing, sometimes silent and not recognizable, but sometimes accepted as a sign of the past, but in many Italian cities and villages. This is a case of very explicit monuments in the capital of the country, such as the Palace of Italian Civilization in Rome, with a phrase from the discourse with which Mussolini announced the invasion of Ethiopia, or the obelisk with the white dukes written on it, described in a famous article written by Ruth Ben-Ghiat in the New Yorker, entitled Why Are So Many Fascist Movements Standing in Italy? But also monuments to local and national fascist leader. We can find also monuments to local and national fascist leader, streets entitled to fascist leaders active in the colonized, or people or fascist leaders signing the racial laws, or on battles of the Second World War in which Italy fought with the Nazis, and many other signs of this commemoration of a fascist past. This is an heritage of fascist memory which is considered untouchable by the vast majority of the country, no matter if right-wing or left-wing, nostalgic or anti-fascist, and which is not fully recognized as a past with which to come to term, even if cherished, and it is cherished as part of the national patrimony heritage. This attitude toward the fascist heritage goes together with far-right activism, which was developed at least since the 90s in a more explicit way, for the denomination of streets and monuments after fascist leaders and militants for their service as leaders of post-war fascist parties, notwithstanding their role in the Repubblica Sociale, in the last of the Mussolini governments, or in the war, or in the colonial territory. Or the activism to the dedication of streets and monuments to fascist leaders considered national heroes or intellectuals, notwithstanding their role in the squadrismo or in the development of fascist and racist measures in the colonies or in Italy. I think that the presence of this sign in the country demonstrates the complexity with which the fascist heritage is conserved, preserved, and accepted in Italian society. Certainly, this is only part of the picture. Although anti-fascism has been the object of a vast criticism and of distance by many political leaders of what is called the Second Republic, civil society in Italy is not indifferent to the memory of the victims of fascism and to the Italian responsibility in the interwar period and after. recent history, for example, demonstrate that this narration, the feebleness of this narration is due to the fact that it is often not part of a political project in which the final aim is the strengthening of democratic institutions and their values, which should bring together individual and social rights, solidarity and dignity for individuals, notwithstanding nationality, gender, religion, etc. And the fact that in a way left-wing party and democratic party were not able to, in the last 20 to 30 years, to mix together the memory of anti-fascism with the general political program of their party is I think, part of the ways in which far-right activism with regard to the past was able to grow and to change the political and cultural attitude of the Italian toward this fascist past. I would stop here for the moment, and I will be happy to discuss further issues on this in the following moments.
Thank you very much, Giulia, and thank you very much for bringing this into the context of the current state of democracy in Europe. And that is, of our larger group, that is the concern that is driving our research, our collective research endeavor to think about how the past still shapes contemporary politics, and the realization that many of our democratic values and democratic institutions are built on what we've learned also from the authoritarian past of the 20th century, namely fascism, National Socialism in Germany, right? So you can see how the republics were built on the legacy and, what we've now, looking back, have realized, what went bad in the Weimar Republic and before 22 in Italy. So, in this respect, history and how we tell this history is very much part of our contemporary narratives. But what we also see is how these narratives of the 20th century change in their meaning and, how they commit political forces for new generations. What exactly does it mean, the memory of fascism or National Socialism in the German context? So that is exactly where what we try to understand, and thank you for bringing the attention to the rise of right-wing populist parties that in a way provide the context for our critical analysis and investigation to the past, and also how the 20th century still haunts us in terms of buildings, of the legacy built into our public lives, right? And that seems to be an ongoing debate. Spain is another good example of more recently addressing this past. It seems not so long ago, but still it is with us, and it is built into the fabric of our most European societies in this respect. So an ongoing challenge. So thank you very much, Giulia. With this, I would like to hand it over to Amy, and please, you can take the floor for us. And
thank you.
Ready.
Thank you for your contribution, Giulia. That was really fascinating, kind of brilliant overview of the European landscape and kind of honing in on Italy itself. My work looks, as Oliver kindly said in his introduction, I look at the uses of memory by the far right in Italy today. I'm in the process at the moment of finalizing my first book on the Rogo di Primavalle, which was an attack on a far-right family that happened in Rome in 1973, and for various reasons has become incredibly powerful as a symbol of what the far-right perceives as far-right persecution at the hands of an anti-fascist state in the almost 50 years since the tragedy took place. So I really look at how those memories are used to build far-right communities. I had my deadline for the first submission of the draft about 3 days after the Italian election. So had a kind of hasty and somewhat frantic period after the Italian election and before submission of trying to write a preface to the book that really kind of reflected on political developments and how that might make some predictions about how that might shape commemoration. And when I was writing it, I found myself really thinking about these discussions that we have internationally, I suppose. And I read a New York Times article the day after the election that diagnosed Italy's kind of deliberate amnesia of its post-war period and this kind of collective amnesia of its fascist past. And I started thinking about how kind of useful these discussions are actually, and whether instead of always talking about amnesia and forgetting, it's more useful perhaps to think about the role of memory and to look at what is remembered, and how that memory is used to legitimize far-right politics in a constitutionally anti-fascist republic. Italian neo-fascists have long used memory as a chance to stamp their symbols, which are banned, and ideology into public space, and to contest those anti-fascist memories that they deem incompatible with their kind of nationalist view of history. And in doing that, they kind of build political identity around memory. And memory of the historic far right was ever present during Meloni's campaign. Some of her rhetoric evoked that of Mussolini indeed, but also of the neo-fascist party, the Movimento Sociale Italiano. She stitched through some kind of historically loaded terms into her speeches, offering these kind of complicit nods to those on the far right who recognize that rhetoric there. So I'm going to talk a bit about the 1970s, and then kind of move us forward as well to the more contemporary era and talk a bit about what I've observed in neo-fascist communities today. But before I do that, I want to pick up, Oliver mentioned in his introduction about Meloni and her party's kind of picking up of historic neo-fascist symbols. And in August 2022, Meloni tweeted this image on the left-hand side of the screen, demonstrating the party's new logo, which, as you'll see at its heart, has this tricolore flame. And she declares it a symbol of which we're proud of. This symbol is a direct echo of the logo of the Movimento Sociale Italiano, the MSI, the party that was born from the flames of, born from the embers of fascism, and kind of fan the flames of neo-fascism, to continue the metaphor, for decades after the fall of fascism itself. And it's thought that this flame, which obviously has the Italian flag within it, represents a kind of timeless commitment to honor the Mussolini's memory through contemporary politics. So her explicit declaration of pride in this symbol really spoke directly to the long-standing supporters of the far right, who had mourned the loss of this symbol in the mid-1990s, when the Movimento Sociale Italiano and its logo and kind of debates around its fascist heritage really climaxed. And the then leader Gianfranco Fini dissolved the party, did away with its logo, and relaunched as Alleanza Nazionale. And this is the line of heritage from which Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia descends, which I'll touch on shortly. Continuing this kind of nod to the 1970s and to the neo-fascist past, in a sort of gesture of solidarity with the far right of the 1970s, on the morning of the party conference in Milan in April 2022, so just last year, Meloni took the time out of what was presumably an incredibly busy day to attend the official commemoration ceremony for Sergio Ranelli, a member of the MSI youth who was shot dead in 1975 and whose memory remains a kind of foundational moment for far-right youth even today. So I think we really need to think about how turning our attention to the party's uses of memory can help us to understand the legitimization of far-right politics in Italy today. The party, Giulia touched on questions of kind of monuments and street names, etc. And the party is, and its local councillors as well, is behind long-standing calls to dedicate roads to Giorgio Almirante, who was the leader of the Movimento Sociale Italiano for decades. And this kind of stamping of memory into public space is something that I really expect to see more of as Fratelli d'Italia kind of continues to govern in Italy. So I'll talk briefly about this kind of moment from the 1970s that shows that MSI, the neo-fascist party that emerged after fascism, its engagement with violence, and touch on how, as Giulia alluded to there, the Fratelli d'Italia kind of touch on this memory of the MSI rather than memory of fascism itself. And then I'll move into the kind of more recent age. So a bit of background for those who are unfamiliar perhaps with the MSI. This party was founded in 1946, and it was really divided from the outset, both kind of politically and ideologically, but also geographically. And in the north, the party's support came from many of those who had experienced Mussolini's Repubblica di Salò, the Italian social republic, many of whom wanted to actually see a return of fascism, whereas elsewhere, the kind of aim of MSI supporters was more conservative and not necessarily taking on this kind of staunchly pro-fascist approach. But Giorgio Almirante, who is this very important leader of the party for a really long time, he'd actually been part of the cabinet chief he'd been the cabinet chief in the Ministry for Popular Culture during Mussolini's Salò Republic. So, real direct engagement with Italy's fascist past. And he found himself with a challenge in the 1970s, which was how to bring the kind of more violent elements of the party under control, and in doing so try to kind of gain more electoral success amidst widespread discussion of the party's connections to black shirt violence, kind of black shirt 2.0, if you will. So I'm going to take us now to Milan on the 12th of April 1973 and the so-called March on Milan, really a kind of echo of the March on Rome. In Milan on that date, there was a demonstration that was organized by the MSI, and this demonstration was against left-wing violence. It was led by the MSI Senator Ciccio Franco, who you can see under the right-hand arrow on the left-hand image, and he drew much of his support from those known to be violent. So he was planning to lead this MSI demonstration through the streets of Milan, and it had originally been authorized, but at the very last minute, the Milanese prefecture banned the demonstration. And the MSI tried to reach Ciccio Franco to tell him to call this off, but he was already on his way, as were coach loads, bus loads, car loads of his supporters from all over Italy. He arrives in Milan and he goes straight to the MSI base in Via Mancini, and he's recalled to Rome, but he says there's no flight until much later, so I'm going to stay here for a bit. And despite the orders of the party and indeed the Milanese prefecture to ban this event, and this ban had been communicated on television, on radio, etc., lots of demonstrators arrived in Milan to join him, and they stand outside the office and begin to chant Boia chi molla, which is a chant that was sung by the black shirts themselves. Franco and some other important figures in the MSI came out from the MSI headquarters and began to walk through the streets of Milan. And this was seen to be a kind of nod of approval to those on the far right who had come to the city to demonstrate and engage in political violence, a sort of validation. And as they marched through the city, they encountered those on the far left and clashes ensued. And as you can see on the right-hand side, police tried to use tear gas to kind of control these crowds. To cut a long story short, there's a lot of violence, and grenades are thrown, as are kind of stones and other kind of rudimentary weapons. And this results in the killing of a policeman, Antonio Marino, who dies on the streets of Milan, and he's killed instantly. And this event is known as the March on Milan, or Milan's kind of Black Thursday. A total of 21 police officers and around 7 civilians are injured that day. And of course, we have the death of the policeman there. As a result of this March on Milan, the international and national media begins to really explicitly talk about the MSI's engagement in political violence and question whether this is the return of fascism, so squadrismo 2.0. Media coverage really makes clear that there's this division within the MSI between those who really see violence as a means to kind of achieve political aims and those who are more conservative and moderate in their approach. But the threat of fascist violence is really felt at this period and connected to the MSI. My key point that I wanted to show you in the previous slide. I've forgotten, which I must show you now, that the image on the far left, the arrow on the far left, this is Ignazio La Russa, who we heard from Giulia before. She mentioned is president of the Italian Senate. So he is there, and he's photographed there as part of this moment of great political violence in Milan, linked to the MSI. He was part of the MSI's youth front at this point, and shown to be present at this moment of violence. Anyway, a brief interlude on him before I move on to the contemporary era. We can see his, what is this, not a tweet, an Instagram post. He posted this in December to honour the anniversary of the foundation of the MSI. And in his caption, he writes that his father was one of the founders of the MSI in Sicily, and really kind of celebrates his father's commitment to this ideology. I think what's really interesting is this way that kind of family heritage is being used as an acceptable way to effectively honour the neo-fascist past, this kind of shield that seems to mean that you're able to openly honour the MSI in this way. And this reverence of the MSI and this kind of celebration of the MSI is really a hot point in the debates around Fratelli d'Italia and its neo-fascist roots here. So let's skip forward to the present day. I'll keep this brief, but I just want to take us to Bradapio, which is Mussolini's hometown in the north of Italy, near to Forlì, Bologna, that kind of area, and think about commemoration of Mussolini and the memory of fascism today, and indeed the mythologization that's part of this rehabilitation of fascist memory among neo-fascist groups. So every year people gather on various anniversaries linked to fascism, or indeed to Mussolini's. That might be a birthday, or indeed the anniversary of the March on Rome. And I attended this in 2017, which would have been the 45th anniversary of the March on Rome, and observed how people behave there. And typically what happens is people gather on the kind of main street, which is full of cafes. I mean, it's a small town, it's not full of cafes. It has some cafes and some of these renowned shops that sell Mussolini merch, and they visit those and kind of gather together, and there's an atmosphere of people seeing each other for the first time in a while. They then march up to the cemetery in which Mussolini is buried, where his family mausoleum is, and then you enter there and go downstairs, and a fascist salute is performed in front of Mussolini's tomb, which you can see in the bottom right-hand image, which also shows this guy wearing a fez, signing a fascist kind of guest book, which I would love to have read, but it was a slightly edgy experience, so I didn't have a chance to see that. But what does one write in such a book? The mind boggles. And then people kind of gather outside in the car park in front of the cemetery, perform the fascist salute, take group photographs, and kind of have drinks. And it's this sort of subversive atmosphere, this kind of sense that this is our moment to project our symbols, this kind of outside of normal time, outside of the normal expectations of Italian society, this real kind of subversive moment. What's fascinating to me, though, is that many people then jump onto a coach to visit Villa Carpena, which is Mussolini's family home, 13 kilometers from Padua. It was bought after World War II, bought much later, around the turn of the millennium, by a private collector businessman who's also purchased a lot of Mussolini-related kind of memorabilia, which he has used to bring this house kind of back to life and stage it to make it appear as though someone is still in place, still living there, but also kind of it's basically a sort of domestic shrine. And it's a fascinating place in terms of thinking about the role of memory or perhaps myth in the creation of far-right collective identity and kind of group cohesion today. So you have to take a guided tour, which is full of sort of revisionist views on the past and historical inaccuracies. And as you're wandering around into various rooms, the study, the bedroom, the kitchen, etc., you encounter these exhibits, these kind of relics of Mussolini's life, which turn the house into basically a domestic shrine. So we have here the bullet or part of the shrapnel that injured Mussolini in the First World War, and also the bottle of wine that Mussolini's wife was supposed to have drunk on the day that she died. And there's this suggestion that kind of time has really stopped and stood still in this house, which kind of gives it some sort of sacred aura. You can really see people, the impression, the kind of emotional impression that this house has on its neo-fascist visitors. There's real reverence and kind of quiet and wonder through this material culture of fascist nostalgia. Authenticity is a central point, as kind of focus point of this museum. The tour guide assures visitors that these are all authentic items and that their authenticity has been validated. And not only are they authentic in that this is the dinner plate that the family used, but it's also a sort of double authenticity because it's in the space that it was used. So we see these kind of double layers of authenticity there. And then you move through the museum into his bedroom where mysticism is really celebrated. This mirror, this whole story is told about how a sick child visits and sees Mussolini's reflection in the mirror on the chest of drawers, and he's cured, or at least on the path to being cured, something along those lines. So this kind of suggestion of him as an ever-present and omnipotent kind of spiritual leader, his eternal presence is really celebrated there. So we have the promotion of old myths that were around during the fascist regime, and then kind of new myths. This kind of, yeah, double layer here. So I really see this house as a closed and almost protected space for the performance of nostalgia that plays a really important role in these days in which neo-fascist groups kind of come together in basically a rehabilitation of Mussolini's memory and the building of new myths through memorialization spaces. I've overrun a bit there, so I'll stop talking and listen to your questions.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you for taking us to Northern Italy for a little while and give us a sense of what indeed, the commemoration of the fascist past is. And it's instilled in me the question, whether the contemporary far right, the Fratelli d'Italia, really take inspiration from the commemoration of Italy's fascist past, whether this is really, or this is more folkloristic. To what degree does it still shape contemporary political identities, right? Clearly, it is being used by a particular part of the population, the political scene in Italy. Or whether, the decline of anti-fascism is probably the more worrying thing in terms of the health of democracy, that some of the principles on which, the Italian Republic has been based are being eroding because it's no longer seen as so relevant. I think the former editor of the La Repubblica, Ezio Mauro, that was his comment after the election of Meloni, to say, look, what we've learned from there, he refers to the presidential reform that is introduced by the Meloni government now, all those measures we took put into place to protect democracy from a strong president, from a strong man, all these kind of things, they're no longer relevant, right? So it is both, right? The commemoration of the fascist past, but also how, in a way, the commitments on which the Republic in Italy was built after the war are being revisited and redefined. I'm looking at the time. I know, Amy, you have to leave a quarter past or so. It gives us another 20, 25 minutes. So maybe I open it up. Unless, Giulia, do you have any immediate reaction to what you've heard from Amy, or the other way around? If not, maybe we could invite our listeners, and what you could do is simply raise your hand, and then if you like, is there any question from the audience at this stage? So please feel free to. Asla, you could start your camera if you'd like.
Hello, hello everybody, and thank you very much for the presentations. Very, very stimulating. I would have a question with regards to a point that Professor Albanese made about the opportunity of not maybe defining the relationship of Italy with fascism and the fascist legacy as deliberate amnesia. So it's better to try to understand what is remembered. So in this respect, I would like to ask you how the history books at schools have been addressing the legacy of fascism, and if whether this comeback of fascism is in a way related to the way that history books never really maybe addressed the legacy of fascism, or never really addressed fully the legacy of fascism. And connected to that, I would also like to ask maybe the two of the panelists. I think that in Italy there is something called a law that punishes the apology of fascism. So how is it possible that this kind of commemoration of Mussolini and all the monuments related to fascism connects to the institutional acceptance of them? Thank you very much.
Whoever wants to go first.
Thank you. Thank you, Padua, for the important question. History books and how fascism is regarded. There are two problems here. One is the fact that the curriculum of history has changed in the last years, and many classes do not have in-depth analysis of the interwar period, which is often done at the very end of their last year of school. And this is certainly one part of the problem, which is also linked to the fact that in the last 20 years, more or less, there has been a very important attention to the memory of the Shoah and of the deportation of the Jews, which has been for the most divided from the memory of Italian fascism. What does it mean? It means that the law which institutionalized the Giorno della Memoria, the Day of Memory in Italy, which is located in the 27th of January, the day of the opening of the doors of Auschwitz and of the liberation of the camp of Auschwitz, has been chosen explicitly as a date not concerning directly Italian deportation involvement. For example, another date was proposed at the beginning, which was the day in which there was the deportation of the Jews in Rome, but the date of Auschwitz was preferred to the date of the deportation of the Jews in Rome. And the law for the implementation of this day does not refer a single time to the word fascism. That means that in many schools from primary to high school, this Giorno della Memoria is developed by speaking of the deportation of the Jews, sometimes of the Italian racial laws of 1938, but often without thinking of the relationship of these laws with the previous history of the fascist regime, and without thinking of the role of Italian as perpetrators and as part of the process of the deportation of Italian Jews and of the deportation also of European Jews, since Italian was an occupant country. So as you can see, I mean, on the one hand, we have a school which is poor in developing knowledge of the interwar years, and this is mostly important for the generation that goes from mine to older people, which is the majority of the country, because sometimes with the youngster they know something more or less, because also the idea of doing a global and European history brings in a way to dismiss an attention to the national history of fascism, and this is also that can be part of the scarce awareness of the history of Italian fascism. And on the other hand, we have this huge issue on the history of the Nazism, the Shoah, the deportation, etc., which in a way confuses the ways in which we look at Italian fascism. And I think this is a very relevant part of the way in which the memory of fascism interacts with the ways in which far-right movements are looked at and considered. As for the law on the apology of fascism, it is a very good question, but I don't have the answer. So the fact is that although we have this law, what happens is that this is never used, and this is every time there is a denunciation for apology of fascism in tribunals, this gesture and this how do you say, this way of expressing this nostalgia to fascism are looked and considered as private aspect and not with as an apology or a political position. So that nobody is fined or even judged as responsible for apology of fascism. And you can guess that now it is even worse, as the president of the Senate is doing the declaration he is doing about his possession, his private possession of a bust of Mussolini and etc.
Maybe Amy can help us there. It would be very, unimaginable to even think about something like this, having a shrine for Mussolini in the German context, right? So there you have pretty strong enforcement of these laws, right, in this respect. But Amy,
Yeah, I mean, a few things, just jumping in on what Giulia was saying about the legge Scelba and this kind of lack of application. I was reading from my book about Almirante in the 1970s and him being kind of pursued for, with that law in mind, for reconstitution of the fascist party. And he was being investigated for that, and this case was trying to be built. And immediately the left-wing press came out with several articles about this, really saying, actually, it's best not to go there because what we risk doing is creating a martyr, which in turn kind of strengthens the emotional power of the narrative that the far right is sort of in some way persecuted and unable to express itself in anti-fascist Italy. And there was this real kind of paranoia that might in turn strengthen support for the far right. I asked the police at the Predapio commemoration ceremony kind of why nothing was being done in terms of this law, and they were just, lascia stare, because if not, we're going to create, even more conflict and it will gather even more attention. So just better to let it kind of slide by than risk whipping up a frenzy there. One of the things I think is really fascinating to compare with this question of the power of fascist memory is to think about Giacomo Matteotti, who's another of my research interests. And I've been to his Casa Museo, which is a similar sort of setup, his old kind of family home that's been recreated into a museum. And just the visitor numbers, I think I worked out that 100 times more people go to the Mussolini one than to the Matteotti one. So Matteotti being the first kind of prominent anti-fascist martyr killed in 1924. And his house is equally hard to reach as Predapio. Neither of them are in main cities or on easy to reach trains, etc. And just nobody goes. It hasn't got that pull, that kind of emotional attraction that Villa Carpena has for those on the far right. I was the first person to visit for a week or something when I went and had a look around. Yeah, very uneven levels of commitment to those respective memories in many ways.
Thank you, Amy. And that was what I observed over the past weeks that we have the Fratelli d'Italia in government now, is that some of its advocates and supporters came out to say, now finally the criminalization of those remembering fascism in a particular way, right, the far right, has come to an end, right? Yeah, and what the ban on these views on the memory is now being lifted, right? It's interesting how they openly advocate for rehabilitating some of the memory in this respect. We have two comments / questions in the box here. One is about, what is actually, that picks up on Fasila's question about education, that comes from Anne, about what do young people actually are taught about the history and dangers of fascism. And the other question is, to what degree are we talking about a marginal fringe part of the political spectrum that goes out in black shirts, right, and attends these neo-fascist meetings? Is this really, is this what we see with the rise of the Fratelli Italia? Isn't it more a kind of a strong conservative movement rather than one in the neo-fascist tradition, right? Yeah. So the question is, how relevant is this more extreme part of the party, and should we be concerned about them, or is this really something that Meloni herself said, this is on the margin, we're not driven by their agenda, right? So how politically important and influential is this more radical part of this party?
I mean, yeah, I agree. We're not talking huge numbers here that turn out in Padua all the time. I think it is part of a broader pattern of normalization of far-right memory activities. I think if you look to just this week or the week before, I forget, commemoration of Acalarencia, which was from the 1970s, another attack on the far-right martyrs. And that I've been keeping an eye on because of my research interest, is getting larger every year. And people turn out in their black outfits, perform the fascist salute, and that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's the same with the commemoration of the Rogo di Primavera. The numbers that turn out there are growing, and more importantly, I think perhaps more chillingly, it's not just I've been to Casa Pound and watched some of the kind of commemorative events held for these events there, and it's not just far-right youth who are turning out with a lack of historical knowledge and are there for kind of perhaps different reasons that aren't necessarily ideological. There are political leaders showing up at these events, right? There are local councillors showing up. There are people who are in positions of power who are offering these complicit nods to those on the far right through the excuse of pan, or sort of across the party, across the political spectrum commemoration. Yeah, so I think, the numbers are small, but they are also gaining support from people who do have a lot of political sway, which is quite frightening to see.
Thank you, Amy. Giulia, any...
Yes, I would stress the fact that I don't think that these aspects of the memory of fascism, both neo-fascism and fascism, are central to the consent that Meloni and his party enjoyed at the election and is enjoying. So I wouldn't like to run the risk of stressing too much this aspect, which I consider important and which I study as part as the reason and the strongest reason for these people are into government or into power. Because for me, the risk of considering this the reason of their success risk to not making us understand the real reason for they have been voted, and to understand and to see how to connect the country with democratic values again. This is a general assessment, but I think it's very, very important because yes, I think it's very, very important. On the other hand, I think that the Meloni government and this situation is possible because of the fact in which, because of the way in which the memory of fascism and of neo-fascism has been dealt in the country and outside the country for many, many years. If you ask in the street in Italy, if what they think, if they think that the Red Brigade or neo-fascists were the responsible for more killing in the 70s, most of the people will answer that the most responsible were the Red Brigades, which in terms of numbers is not true. Yeah. Which brings us to a question, and the question is how this far-right and neo-fascist movement are connected to a wider conservative sensibility and a wider conservative political culture which is present in the country. And I think that it is with this political spectrum that as intellectual and as historians, we should engage more. Because in a way, it would be important that this part of the country recognize that the history of neo-fascist movement and the history of fascism is not a history of conservativeness, but it's a history of non-democracy. Right. And I think that the conservative world, for various reasons, cultivated this idea also because the greatest part of Italy was fascist between the 20s and the 30s, cultivated an idea of fascism as a mild authoritarian regime, which is not true.
Yeah, I wonder.
As well as, I mean, there's also, there's also a scare of the success and the force of the radical left-wing party and socialist and communist party, which were strong historically in the country, which led to the fact of not recognizing the risk for and the distance of this neo-fascist and fascist party regime movement from a democratic institution, I would say.
I think I totally agree. It's important to stress that, you know, these contemporary neo-fascists are not the reason that Meloni was elected, right? This isn't a symbol of a longing for a fascist past. I think I see it more as a symbol of frustration with the present and total discontent with the government. You know, she played it really well by positioning Fratelli d'Italia as something outside of normal institutional politics that was untarnished by what had gone on before, both politically and economically. It's more about the present. And I don't see it so much as you just said so eloquently there, Giulia, that it's not about, you know, the black shirt supporters kind of being behind Meloni's success. But I do wonder if it works the other way and whether her kind of party's sort of complicit nod to neo-fascism will in turn give a sort of boost to those who are at the very extreme edges, who aren't necessarily, you know, voting her in, but who might actually see her election success as a sign that their views are becoming more mainstream, I suppose, in some way.
Yeah, and we do see this dynamic working in other countries, you know, where we see increased right-wing violence and attacks on democratic institutions. You know, and Giulia, just to follow up on what you just said, you know, I think it's important to be aware that the conservative spectrum in Italy was very much part of the anti-fascist consensus after the Second World War, and that the neo-fascists were always on the fringe, right? And you know, the Christian Democrats in Italy were champions of European integration, the Gasperi and so forth, right? Yeah. So, but now we see a force coming from the more far right, in a way claiming the legacy of conservatism in Italy and saying, you know, we are a staunchly conservative party. And, you know, the dividing lines in Italian politics become blurred, right? And that could open at least the possibility of a more right-wing conservative force in, if you want to call it this way, in the Italian context, right? In a way, putting an end to a particular legacy of the Democrazia Cristiana in Italy that has basically disappeared, is about to disappear in Italian politics. But that would open up the discussion of a whole new webinar, and it would be fascinating to follow this up. But I understand, you know, you have to leave us soon, so we have some more questions about, you know, how the whole migration issue, human rights, the irregular migrants that come to the shores, a fundamental political question, a fascinating one, but probably one we can't go into. Let me take this opportunity to thank you both very much, Giulia and Amy. You know, it's been great that you could join us on your afternoon, late afternoon, our morning here, and contribute to our ongoing discussion, in particular on the legacy of the memory of fascism, the memory of the 20th century, and how it informs contemporary party politics, but probably more importantly, the stability of democracies in Europe and North America. So it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and let me greatly thank you on behalf of the University of Victoria and our network and our funder, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Ottawa in Canada. So thank you very much, and all of you for joining us today. I think we could continue this discussion for a while, but I think we have to come to an end now, and with this, I would like to close and end the recording. And again, great degree of gratitude sent to both of you in the UK and in Italy. Thank you and goodbye.